So you've heard you should be sewing your quilt blocks at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you might be wondering, what on earth is a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance? Well, in this video I'm going to run through everything for you, including what a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance is, what a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance is, what actually is the difference, and how much impact does it really have on your quilts. And trust me, it's really easy to achieve a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think it sounds way scarier than it really is. So stick with me and let's debunk the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So first things first, let's talk about what a seam allowance is. It's the distance from the edge of the fabric here to your stitches. So if we take a look at my seam allowance right here, it measures exactly 1/4 inch. So what I'll do is I'll take the edge of my ruler, place it on the edge of my fabric, pop the 1/4 inch line on top of my stitches, and I can see that's absolutely perfect. So in sewing terms, we'd say this seam allowance is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So why isn't just a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance good enough? Well, the thread and the fold of the fabric take up their own space. And even though it might not seem like much, they do. And when you sew several pieces together, that little bit starts adding up. So for example, it's not pressed, but I will just get a ruler and pop that on top. So these two pieces started at 2.5 inches. And then if we take into account the seam allowance, it should measure 4.5 inches. But can you see here? It's just slightly shy of that 4.5 inches. Now, if we sewed a lot of blocks together, that's going to really add up quickly and make our block considerably smaller than it needs to be. And that's where the magic of a scant 1/4 inch comes into play. By sewing just a few threads shy of a 1/4 inch, we hit that perfect scant 1/4 inch, allowing for the thread and the fold of our fabric, ensuring our finished blocks come out at the exact size they should be. So if I take my ruler now and place it right on the edge of my fabric there, can you see that the lines on my ruler are sitting actually right next to the stitches? You can see the stitches here. So that is a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So just to clarify, a scant 1/4 inch is when your seam allowance is just a smidge or a thread or two less than a 1/4 inch. Now you might be wondering, how on earth do I measure that? Well, what I like to do is take 3 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch pieces. Now I do like to cut them out myself. A charm pack seems like a good option for these, but because of the zigzag edges, I think it's a bit tricky to get exact measurements. So I personally like to cut them out myself. And then what we do is we sew them together, press, and then we're going to measure this middle piece here. Now, if we started off with a 2.5 inch square, we've lost 1/4 inch on this side, 1/4 inch on this side. So this center piece should measure 2 inches, right? Well, it only will measure that if we've used a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, this sample here, I've used my scant 1/4 inch seam foot. And for this sample here, I've used a regular 1/4 inch foot. Now, I just did this as an example to show you. Don't worry, I am going to show you on your sewing machine how to work out a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is just to show you the difference. So if I measure my first one, and I'll measure that center piece. If I put this edge on the seam here and my line on the seam here, it's 2 inches, and you can see that's absolutely perfect. And then if I measure the whole piece, it's measuring 6.5 inches. Now that's perfect. Now if we measure the one with a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to pop this edge right on top of that seam there, can you see that we're just shy of our 2 inches? And then if I measure my whole piece, we're actually quite a bit shy there. So can you see that if we sewed lots of pieces together, by the time we've done that with a regular 1/4 inch foot, we're slowly losing a lot of the width that we need. So that's the importance of a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Can you see what a difference it makes? Now it's important to note that scant 1/4 inch seam allowances are not always necessary. For example, when you sew basic pieces together like an I Spy quilt, it's not going to matter if it ends up just a little bit smaller, or if you're sewing the same blocks together, for example, the rail fence quilt that we did. When it does matter is when you want your blocks to finish at an exact size. Say, for example, our mystery block of the month, when we're making a sampler quilt with 12 different blocks, we really do want them to finish up the same size. But remembering, if you need to, you can always cut down your blocks down to that smaller size as well. Now remember, if you're just a beginner, this is really not something you should worry about. You should just be worrying about sewing a consistent seam allowance, whatever that is, whether it's a 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch, and getting nice straight seams, really just stay there. But if you're trying to work out why those blocks aren't perfect, or you're really trying to fine tune your quilting skills, then a scant 1/4 inch is what we should be aiming for. So now we need to work out what we're going to use as our guide to get our perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. It doesn't matter what you use. You might use the edge of your foot here. You might use the markings on your foot plate. You might have a magnetic guide you use, or you might use tape. But whatever you use, we have to work out our measurements and know that's what we're going to do. Now, if you've got a Juki TL sewing machine, you actually got a scant 1/4 inch foot with your sewing machine. I personally actually find it is a tiny bit too scant. So what I do is when I'm putting my fabric underneath it, I'll just lower my foot there. What I like to do is to be able to see the fabric just slightly poking out on the side there. So just ever so slightly. So for example, I don't want it right under my foot and completely level with my foot. Then it's going to be a little bit too scant. I just want to see the fabric just peeking through there. It's just such a small difference. But for me, that's when I get my perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance with the Juki sewing machine. Now, not everyone has a Juki sewing machine. For example, if you're using a Brother, I used to sew with a Brother sewing machine, you can actually use your regular 1/4 inch foot and then just move your needle over just one tiny little notch, and then you have your perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's just brilliant on any machine where you can move the needle. On the Juki sewing machines, we can't move the needle. We have to use guides to change that seam allowance. So you might have a 1/4 inch foot with a guide on it. The 1/4 inch feet can be different and it varies on what brand sewing machine you're using. But all I'm trying to say is grab your 1/4 inch foot and then let's try and work out the best way to get that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance on it. For example, if I was using this one, instead of butting my fabric up against that bar there, I would try just lining it up with the very edge there of the foot, and that just to me looks like a few threads short of a 1/4 inch. But basically what we have to do at this point is just have a play with working out what's going to be our best guide. Now you might want to try a magnetic guide. All you need to do is pop that on your foot plate and it attaches, and then you just move it around. And so what you'd do is you'd get your 2.5 inch pieces, sew and test it and move it until it's perfect. I personally have only had luck with these magnetic guides on my Juki sewing machine because everything's metal. It just sticks to this thing like really well. I did try one once with my Brother sewing machine and I just found that it didn't stick well and it kind of just moved around too easily. But we need to try and work out what's going to work best for us. So this is another option that you could use to try and work out your scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Something else you might like to try is this diagonal seam tape by Cluck Cluck Sew. I've heard raving reviews from people using it. I've never tried it, but let's open it up and take a look and see how this would work. So what this tape is it's got the center mark here, which is your needle line. And then on both sides of the needle line, we've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what we do is we take the tape and we line it up with the needle line. And we don't want to go over our little feet there so we can use it as our guide. And then we're going to take that on. And then when you're happy, you can cut it. So then what you'd do is you'd put it on the black line there, working out your best 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now again, we're trying to get the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it would be a matter of playing around and working out, does it need to be next to the line, on top of the line, or just past the line to get that perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance? I haven't used it before, so I'm sorry I can't tell you which line you'd use as your guide, but I would just do a tester and work out what will be my guide if I use this tape. And like I said, I've heard raving reviews, so it might be worth a try. So next up, we have masking tape or painter's tape, and this is a favorite of mine. It does work a treat. The first thing we're going to do is make sure our needle is down and our foot is up. Then we're going to take our ruler, find our 1/4 inch mark, line that up with the needle, and remember we need it to be scant, so we need it to be just a little bit over. Then what I'm going to do is take a piece of my painter's tape and just put it right next to the edge of my ruler there. that is my scant 1/4 inch mark. But the beauty of using this tape is we can layer it. So what we do is we just take a few pieces and pop it on top. And then what happens is we create a ridge, which gives us something to butt our fabric up against. And this is a really helpful option. So then what we'll do is we'll just take our fabric, line it up with our masking tape, and we've got a really nice guide there. I'd put a few more layers on there so I really do have a nice little ridge to butt my fabric up against, and this works a treat. Do make sure you've put it on straight. I just put it on quickly there. We want it nice and straight when it's approaching the needle. So now what you should do is just have a play with your guide and work out what's going to work best for you. And I do recommend making a sample. Cut some 2.5 inch squares, sew them together, and check that middle square is measuring 2 inches. And if it is, well, you've got a perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And trust me, it's not that hard. If you've already been sewing at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, well, we're just moving over that guide just a tiny bit. It really is easier than you think, and I think a lot of people get really worried about it when really you're already sewing with a guide. We're just changing that guide. So if you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button. Even better, hit the subscribe and the bell button so you never miss another video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.